Good afternoon, everyone. We'll start our next session titled Why International Political Economy Matters. The session is chaired by Professor Mandira Sarma. She teaches at the Center for International Trade and Development, SIS. Her research intersects banking and financial system with issues of growth, inclusion, stability, economic development. She is a recipient of Fulbright Fellowship at University of Michigan. And, she's also a DART Senior Visiting Fellowship. She has several publications in high-impact journals. You need no introduction.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Nivedita, for these kind words. Okay. Yeah. Thank you, Nivedita, for these kind words of introduction. Welcome, everybody, for this session, which is by my colleague, Professor Shovon. Just to begin, economic relations form an important aspect of international relations, and at CITD, we focus on economic aspects of international studies, and thus complementing the other areas of international studies like geopolitics, political, cultural, and historical, etc., at School of International Studies. Welcome to this session. I would like to introduce my dear colleague, Professor Amit Shovon, who is the speaker of this session, this lecture. Professor Amit Shovon is a Doctor of Philosophy from Oxford University. He is a Fellow of the Royal Society of Health in London. He is a distinguished economics. He needs no introduction for that. He specializes in global economic issues such as technology, intellectual property rights, trade and development. Earlier, he has served as the director of the Center for Development Studies in Trivandrum. He has been a consultant to the World Bank, UNCTAD, and India's Planning Commission, erstwhile Planning Commission, which is now Niti Aayog. He has been a chair professor at Indian Council for Research on International Economic Relations and a member of the Independent Commission on Development and Health in India. He has numerous publications. He writes widely, and he has published numerous research articles, at least 75 articles that I know, maybe more also, and he has been author to at least 6 books. And today, in this session, he is going to reflect on some recent geopolitical developments in the global South consolidation, to explain why international political economy matters. So without further ado, I am very excited to hear his speech and lecture, and I open this floor to you, Professor Ray.
Thank you.
Yes. They would speak for about 40 to 45 minutes, followed by question answer.
Right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Sarma, for this very kind introduction. Thank you, Dean, for inviting me or given me this opportunity to deliver this lecture on international political economy. And good morning to my colleagues, students, ladies and gentlemen. I am trained as an economist with very little formal training in international political economy, which is a discipline itself. With my specialization in international development and international trade, when I joined SIS 3 decades ago, I didn't fully realize how this distinguished school will foster my academic interest in global affairs, extending beyond the narrow domain of economic theory. In today's world, politics and economics are inseparably linked, either in the national context or in a global context. And that is what the discipline of political economy focuses on. Now, it may be pertinent to begin with a simple working definition of IPE for my convenience. Let us define IPE as the study of how global politics and the global economy are intertwined. Global political developments cannot be fully understood without an understanding of the nuances of the global economy and vice versa. In particular, I would like to use the lens of political economy to explore what kind of challenges are being posed to the post-Cold War unipolar world order. One of the major channels of this challenge is rooted through global South consolidation, pushing us towards a multipolar world order. Now, let us begin with the unipolar moment that started with the disintegration of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War. The USA became the sole global superpower along with its Western allies from the early 1990s. No other country had the capacity to challenge the economic and military supremacy of the USA at that time. Now, we all know the end of history thesis. At least most of us know the end of history thesis. Fukuyama said this marked, quote, not just the passing of a particular period of post-war history, but the end of history. As such, that is the end point of mankind's ideological evolution and the universalization of Western liberal democracy as a final form of human government. Perhaps a peaceful equilibrium had now been attained in the global economic and political arena, which would be characterized by linear, peaceful progress without any conflicts, setbacks. The world lives happily ever after. It will sustain itself. But this prediction obviously didn't turn out to be quite accurate, did it? Early signs of sporadic instances of conflicts, crises, and disequilibrium were visible even in the decade of the 1990s. I mean, I can just name a few. Sporadic incidents of military conflicts that were mostly restricted to specific regions of Eastern Europe. 97, there was a financial crisis which originated in East Asia and was largely confined to East Asia. And thirdly, and this is something important to note, there were challenges being posed to the hegemonic authority of the US, which tried to dictate the global architecture for the control of nuclear weapons. I have distinguished colleagues here from disarmament. And if I may take the liberty of stating that India's refusal to sign the CTBT, despite tremendous hegemonic pressure in 1998, and then its nuclear explosion in the same year, followed by Pakistan. And then, of course, explosions conducted much later by North Korea, which all meant that the number of states with nuclear weapons were increasing. So where is this peaceful, no conflict, happily ever after equilibrium of progress, So these are just early indications. Now, but these were not significant enough to pose a major challenge to the unipolar moment that the world was going through. From the first decade of this century, of course, we see somewhat more strong vibrations. 9/11 attack. US got a major jolt from the 9/11 attack by Islamist forces, and perhaps after the Pearl Harbor, this was perhaps the first time that external forces succeeded in attacking targets on US soil. The narrative of peaceful equilibrium under the end of history thesis in a unipolar world therefore came under very serious scrutiny. Of course, being the unipolar hegemon, the USA came down heavily not only on all parties suspected to be involved in the 9/11 attacks, but also on those who were perceived to be against the USA. I mean, let's not elaborate on that. Second, 2008, there was a global financial crisis which originated in the USA itself and spread rapidly to the rest of the world. Although China and India remained somewhat insulated from this crisis, it did pose a challenge to the concept of linearity of progress in the post-Cold War era. People got a jolt and saying, no, I mean, market-led equilibrium, and it's not all that hunky-dory, we have to take cognizance. And of course, we all know that USA and the Western world could overcome this crisis by handing over massive bailout packages to corporate entities, including major private sector banks, using taxpayers' money from the exchequer. So, the first decade of this century, dissatisfaction with the US-led unipolar world order, along with some disruptive events, started becoming visible in the global south in particular. However, all this simmering dissatisfaction and disruptions notwithstanding, there was yet no sign of any credible or effective threat to this US-dominated world order. Now let me refer to the last 10 years, beginning with the middle of the last decade till now, say roughly to 2014-2015 to 2024-25. Let's see what are these recent things that are happening which would have strong ramifications for the global south consolidation and posing a more credible threat to the unipolar world order. First, China's economic surge. Now, China started growing right after it opened up, after a decade of its opening up, which dates back to late 1970s. By 1990s, China was, had taken off in a massive way. And China's unparalleled progress continued uninterrupted for over three decades, culminating in its overtaking of Japan in 2010 to become the second largest economy of the world after US in GDP nominal terms. But in terms of the size of the economy, China's GDP in 2010 was still only 35% of that of the US. I mean, nowhere close to the US. But in terms of the sustained and robust growth of Chinese economy propelled it to a size of 60% of the US economy by the middle of the next decade, then reaching a peak of 75% of the US economy by 2021. Of course, now it has, again gone down to hovering around 70%. But can you imagine, in nominal terms, China is 70% as large as the US economy, all right? In PPP terms, the picture is even more glaring. And I don't have the time to explain the difference between PPP and nominal. For those interested, may just want to look up and see what the difference is. PPP actually measures the prosperity of a nation for comparative purposes more realistically than the nominal. Now, in PPP terms, China's started off at 76% of the size of the GDP, size of the US in PPP GDP in 2009, and became at par with the US by the middle of the next decade, which is like 2015. So in PPP terms, China became as large as the US economy in PPP terms, all right? And now, then overtook it, and now it's about 127% of the US economy. Now, China's share in global GDP nominal terms rose sharply from 8.4% in 2009 to 15% in 2015, and currently stands at 17%, whereas the US share has continued to be hovering around 25%, all right? In terms of manufacturing GDP, China's economic domination is even more stark. While China's share in global manufacturing GDP steadily rose to reach over 30%, largest in the world, compared to 16% share of the US. From the middle of the last decade, it became quite apparent that China was moving steadily and rapidly, not just to catch up with the US economically as the world, but actually overtake it soon as the world's largest and dominant economy. So that's one point to note in the last 10 years. The second point, which is of course not my domain, but I have noticed this and I would like to flag it. It was also characterized by Russia's military assertion. And for that I would refer to Syria 2015. Russia directly intervened in support of the Assad government in 2015, and this marked a shift of balance of power in the Syrian conflict that started in 2011, 14 or whatever, where by the US supported rebel groups were countered by Russian support to the Syrian government, which continued to remain in power till December 2024. As a matter of fact, this was perhaps the first sign of a challenge to the unipolar military supremacy of the US and its allies in the post-Cold War era. And then, of course, 2014 Crimea. Once, after in the wake of the coup in Ukraine, toppling the existing government to put in place an anti-Russia dispensation there followed internal ethnic conflicts, especially in the Russian-speaking eastern region. Russia responded by claiming back Crimea in 2014. That from Ukraine that was initially demarcated as Ukrainian territory after the disintegration of the Soviet Union. This further signaled that Russia was ready to assert itself against the military supremacy of the West. So China's economic dominance and Russia's mild assertions, back. The idea, this was giving signals to the rest of the world. The idea that led unipolarity can perhaps be effectively challenged jointly by Russia and China by their military and economic strengths respectively was becoming increasingly evident. It thus created a sense in other major players of the world that unipolarity need not have to be accepted as fait accompli in deciding their positioning not only in global political order but also in economic and cultural spheres. Now, the cultural sphere is very problematic too, or difficult, not problematic, complex to prove. But there is no doubt that we observe resurgence of cultural identities and heritage in different parts of the world. Even in the last session, we heard about cultural assertion in the Pacific Islands. As the military and economic dimension of the West face challenges, it creates more space for the rest of the world to reassert their hitherto suppressed cultural identities. And one point to note is that even the West started accepting this changing perception of the rest of the world, that the unipolar world is possibly being challenged or put under some kind of a questioning. The USA, and how do I conclude this? The USA started seriously responding to this perceived challenge. For instance, the US foreign policy shift towards East and Southeast Asia, pivot to Asia, started taking shape during the last decade. Likewise, during the 2017 ASEAN summit, the leaders of the 4 member countries of the Quad agreed to revive this group to counter and contain China in the Indo-Pacific region. So all these signals that, okay, the US, and then of course I can go on and on. I mean, I2, U2, IMEC, all alternative alliances are being formed, where of course US is very much an active party. Now US, if it actually is an uncontested hegemon, need not have to be did not proactively look for this alliance. So there is some kind of a perception that, okay, these major economic power, particularly China, could be problematic for them. So, US started a continuing trade war. I'll talk about it later while concluding under Trump 2. But during the last 2 years of Trump 1, there was a trade war which started extending beyond tariffs and trade protection to include attempts to ban Chinese products with high-end technologies and Chinese investments, not only in the US market, but also elsewhere. Huawei, or however you pronounce that in the 5G, I'm sorry, pardon my Chinese pronunciation or English pronunciation. So, that's a case in point. Now I turn my attention to country alliances in the global south, how rapidly it's getting consolidated. Now, alliances among global south countries are not a new phenomenon at all. It began with a non-aligned movement of the Cold War period. NAM was established in 1961, we all know these facts, by 5 countries of the global south, namely India, Egypt, Yugoslavia, Ghana, and Indonesia. Later, 120 countries, which were not aligned or against any of the superpowers, joined the group. Although NAM provided quite a forceful voice to the newly independent developing countries seeking opportunities for their economic development, it lacked any effective economic or military clout to act as an alternative global power center, capable of posing a challenge to the existing power centers led by the USA on one hand and the USSR on the other. NAM's primary goal, as I see it, was to keep a balance between the two power poles. Naturally, with the end of the Cold War and the disintegration of the Soviet Union, the relevance of NAM was lost. During the post-Cold War period, several regional alliances emerged in different parts of the global south. Most of them were alliances to promote trade and economic cooperation, as well as social and cultural exchanges, without any major military or strategic agenda. Many of them were regional in nature, such as the African Union, Union of South American Nations, Community of Latin American Caribbean States, and the Pacific Alliance. But one of them was not regional in nature, and that is IBSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa Alliance, established in 2003. It spread across 3 continents, but it was also primarily focused on economic, social, academic, technological, and cultural exchanges without any major strategic component. Another group was formed in 2009, kind of emanating from IBSA, was BRICS. First it was BRIC, established formed in 2009 with 4 members, Brazil, Russia, India, and China, that were perceived to be the rising economic powers of the world. Later, in 2010, South Africa joined this group, became BRICS. It continued to work essentially towards an economic agenda for cooperation and integration. But here I state with bold and highlight. During the initial years, the group planned for setting up a global financial institution to simplify mutual settlements and lending operations among BRICS countries, and thus reduce their dependence on the US dollar and the euro, or the euro. Accordingly, the new development bank was established in 2016. I'll talk about it later. Over the last couple of years, BRICS started on a path of expansion. Several countries from the global south applied for membership of BRICS. At the BRICS meeting of 2023, held in South Africa, 6 countries, Iran, Egypt, Ethiopia, UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Argentina, were invited to join the group. And among these, Argentina declined the invitation soon because after a pro-US regime came to power there, and Saudi Arabia is yet to communicate its official acceptance. Subsequently, in the BRICS summit held in Russia, 13 other countries were invited. There were plenty of applications, by the way. 13 other countries were invited to join as partners. And I can go, it's spread all over the world. Out of these 3 countries, Algeria, Turkey, and Vietnam are yet to formally accept the invitation. And one country, Indonesia, has been inducted as a full member. So now, with 10 member countries and 9 partners, confirmed partners, BRICS has become a large conglomeration of countries from the global south, representing almost all major countries in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, covering 28% of the world GDP, 41 in nominal US terms, and 41% of the world GDP in PPP terms. The GDP shares enjoyed by the BRICS as a whole exceeded the combined share of the G7 nation. The G7 was established because they were the dominant players in the world GDP. Now, BRICS exceed them much by a large margin. Moreover, the 19 BRICS nations collectively enjoy a very significant share of the global oil and mineral resources, including critical minerals. All of these are of strategic importance. If we consider the applicant countries, the shares will inflate even more. Now the question is whether this alignment of BRICS countries, members, partners, and applicants, can be considered as a challenge to the unipolar hegemonic world order, even if the group does not have a direct agenda to confront. Perhaps the expanding BRICS alliance may be viewed as a challenge to the economic hegemony of the West, but not a strategic threat to them at this point. But this is distinctly different from the earlier Global South collective such as the NAM. NAM did have some ideational impact on global political framework, but wherein voices of the Global South were heard at various international fora like the UN. However, this was not backed by sufficient material capacity to pose a real challenge to the bipolar world order dominated by the US and the USSR. But BRICS is not that. It's actually posing an economic challenge to the unipolar hegemony. BRICS, on the other hand, gives a clear signal that large tracts of the world are wary of the Western hegemony, especially in the spheres of economics, trade, and finance. For instance, the Global South has experienced how a democratic global institution like the WTO was made irrelevant by the might of the US-EU, leading to a proliferation of bilateral and plurilateral agreements countering the multilateral trade framework. So there is a felt need for an alternative multilateral framework for international economic and financial transactions. In fact, BRICS has always emphasized the need for a new global reserve currency. Although one cannot expect an instant transition in such matters, as it entails complex issues of history, legacy, convenience, and inertia. As far as local currency trade or alternative clearing message systems for interbank transactions are concerned, there is definitely some progress in the right direction, although it's extremely complex and difficult to expedite the pace of change. The focus of BRICS is expected to continue to be economic interests and cooperation rather than strategic issues, I believe, at least in some years to come. It's a very democratic and inclusive alliance with non-dominant memberships. It also plays an important and active role in diffusing tensions among member countries and or countries of the Global South through dialogue and negotiation. I give two examples. China acted as a successful mediator. China, one of the prominent members of the BRICS, acted as a successful mediator between Iran and Saudi Arabia to put an end to their long-standing enmity. Likewise, Russian mediation between India and China proved to be successful in resolving some of the simmering border issues that could have exploded any time. Such mediation provides less opportunity, if I may say so, for the unipolar hegemons to capitalize on these internal conflicts in the Global South for their own vested interest. Another important alliance that I would like to highlight is the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that was established in 2001 with 6 members only, China, Russia, and 4 Central Asian countries. The group of 6 expanded to 8 to include India and Pakistan. All that happened in the last 10 years, 2017. Later, Iran joined in 2023 and Belarus in 2024. Now, I wish I had a PPT to show the landmass, the congruous landmass, enormous congruous landmass of Eurasia that SCO covers. Now that has implications. What kind of implications? And of course there are some few landlocked countries who are not part of SCO, but also they are effectively into that landmass. Now, this is in contrast with BRICS, of course, where members and partners are dispersed across the globe. The congruous nature of SCO not only offers enormous trade opportunities, especially in energy and food/other commodities through land routes, but can also act as a deterrent, natural deterrent, in case of any potential external invasion against any member, if all other members cooperate and agree to block the land, sea, and airspace. It's a continuum of land block. Okay? So this demonstrates in no uncertain terms that Global South consolidation against the unipolar order has gathered its own momentum in the last 10 years and is progressing at a pace and scale that the world has not seen earlier. However, it may be worth exploring how far this momentum can be maintained in the light of a few major contemporary geopolitical developments that the world has been witnessing recently. And that is how I conclude. I conclude by looking at some of the recent contemporary geopolitical developments have acted as catalysts in cementing the global South unity to stand up against the Western hegemonic domination in a major way, while some of the other developments are perhaps dampening the pace of this momentum. I'll just take two examples for this. One, which I believe
Professor,
has...
5 more minutes will be okay?
Yes, yes. Yeah, 5 minutes is fine. So first is the Ukraine-Russia war. Here, of course, I would take this opportunity to highlight the importance of economics in geopolitics. In the wake of the Ukraine war, US and its Western allies, they supported Ukraine, but they did not become a direct part of the war, okay? So they supplied all their military assistance and resources and all that. But what they did was even more dangerous. They tried to strangulate the Russian economy through various means so that this war stops. These included imposition of various types of trade and economic sanctions against Russia. The objective was to choke off Russia's economic interactions with these countries. Not only they banned almost all their exports and imports to and from Russia, but also halted Russia's international financial transactions and transaction mechanisms by banning the use of SWIFT system by most Russian banks, as well as forcing the Visa and the MasterCard to withdraw from Russia. Moreover, the Russian financial assets held in banks in the USA and Europe, amounting to the tune of US $300 billion, were frozen by the NATO allies. In September 2022, the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, which was used to transport natural gas from Russia to Europe, was exploded to physically stop any kind of exports of Russian oil to Europe. These countries also imposed ban on air travel to and from Russia, compelled private investors to withdraw their investments from Russia, and imposed ban on future investments. Moreover, the Western allies made serious attempts to persuade the rest of the world to follow their footsteps in combating Russia by strangulating its economy. The US even threatened to impose secondary sanctions on countries and companies that would continue to engage with Russia in trade and economic spheres. All these attempts by the US and its allies notwithstanding, the Russian economy never collapsed. We all know that. We have experts from Russia sitting here, right? It actually started showing signs of progress. This was made possible to a large extent by the unfailing economic support of China and India. For instance, as soon as the sanctions were imposed, both India and China came out to purchase large quantities of crude from Russia that provided a lifeline to the Russian economy in the face of the sanctions. For India, this was perhaps the first and the boldest instance of intervention in a global conflict. I am not an expert on international relations, so please correct me, my distinguished colleagues, if I'm making an overstatement. But to me, this was the first time India is intervening in a global conflict outside its immediate neighborhood ever since independence. A conflict that is taking place in Europe, which has no direct interest of India. I mean, I'm not talking about Bangladesh. I'm not talking about the China war. We have participated, we have engaged in conflicts, we had to, okay? But this is something which is for the first time. India is intervening in a conflict somewhere else. Please think about that, okay? India's bold decision to import Russian crude to process it in Indian refineries and re-export it to Europe may be viewed as a masterstroke in India's economic diplomacy. It not only served India's self-interest, but it benefited all parties. It's a win-win-win. Win for Russia, win for Western Europe, which would have otherwise faced an imminent energy crisis after choking off Russian imports, and win for India, of course. And I would add a fourth win for the global oil market, because the prices stabilized. Otherwise, oil prices would have shot up, affecting all oil importing countries. China also supported Russian banks, but let us not get into that, with financial transaction systems, etc., etc. Now, this was quite an unprecedented show of unity among the, most interestingly, despite appeals by the US and its allies, most countries in the global south refrained from joining them in imposing sanctions against Russia. And this was quite an unprecedented show of unity, I believe, among the countries of the global south that marked a clear setback to the unipolar hegemonic order of the post-Cold War era. This brings to the fore that the challenge to the unipolarity remained no longer just a vision, but it already started taking a concrete shape. But now, I'll turn to another very recent, global political development. And as somebody said, no discussion is complete without taking cognizance of what someone yesterday referred to as the elephant in the room. And that is, of course, Mr. Donald Trump 2.0. Okay? Trump is transactional, if I may be allowed to say so. And as economists, my distinguished colleagues are sitting here, we should have no problems with that. You get what you pay for, right? That's what the market tells us. Now, his policy interventions, let me just give can I take one more minute just to give an anecdote, why Trump is transactional, why this, term came to my mind. People have been talking about it. After his election, the Saudi king invited Trump to break the tradition of making the first state visit to a Western European country, Western allies, and say that, come to Saudi Arabia. What was Trump's response? Oh, I'd love to do that. Why didn't you raise your Saudi investments in the US to 1 trillion? Okay, I'll come. Totally transactional, all right? So, his policy intentions are very clearly stated without mincing words. Now, I'd like to highlight 2 of them only before I conclude. I'll take 2 minutes, okay? Sorry. First, he openly declared trade war against China. This reminds me of the provocative comment during the inaugural speech that theory doesn't matter for practicing diplomacy and foreign policy, which we had debated about, This is an example. Trump, with presumably no knowledge of trade theory, is a very good businessman, but no knowledge of trade theory, declares his policy, which I, as a scholar of trade theory, am convinced will ruin the US economy, if carried out as announced. But he and his foreign policy advisors pay no heed to theory. Interestingly, trade theorists in the US who championed free trade as a global architecture in the 1990s during the formation of the WTO, noted trade theorists, Jagdish Bhagavati, with due apologies to his student, David Greenaway, that gentleman who came there, Professor Deardorff, okay? All of them championed. And why did they do that? They, the formation, they are all quiet now, by the way. I don't hear their statements. But they were very vocal then, because it was the official US position, and they jumped in with their theoretical arguments to convince the rest of the world how excellent it would be to have a world unencumbered by protection and tariffs and restrictions. All right? Now, tongue in cheek, let me give CITD's position on this. When I joined CITD in the 90s, we were all champions of free trade, all right? Because we know trade theory and we know that gains from trade, and we at that point argued that it would be good for India because it will propel India to higher growth paths. And that happened. All right? But we were branded as pro-US at that point. But standing today, I think I can speak on behalf of me and my colleagues, we still believe that this choking of trade and protectionism is bad. It will ruin the US. Now I wonder whether we would now be branded as anti-US. So that is tongue-in-cheek. Now, 100% tariff on BRICS countries. That's the second announcement I'd like to highlight. Trump said there'll be 100% tariff on all BRICS countries, even if they talk about de-dollarization. A clear signal that BRICS is not irrelevant in geopolitics. It is not dead, but it's being stabbed by those who view it as a perceived threat to their hegemony. It is up to the members of the BRICS to decide whether and how to withstand such pressures to fulfill the goal of creating a truly multipolar world order. I conclude with one sentence. The world seems to be moving towards multiple poles. And, if I may say so, India is definitely poised to be one of the poles. So India needs to craft its foreign policy very carefully to balance its relationships with the rest of the poles without losing its strategic autonomy. Thank you so much.
This very comprehensive lecture, you started with debunking the myth of peaceful equilibrium in a unipolar world, and you talked about global financial crisis, and you talked about rising expansion of BRICS, beginning of BRICS and followed by expansion of BRICS into many countries with so many member countries and partner countries. And you also highlighted the recent developments where Trump, number 2, actually views BRICS as a real challenge to unipolarity. And you have highlighted that the emergence of BRICS is not really an imagination, and it's a real way to multipolarity with multiple polars, India being one. With these few words, I thank you once again for this fantastic speech, so to say, and I open the floor for questions, comments, feedback, and any input to Professor Ray.
That's the dangerous Oh my God.
No, I just, with your permission, can I, after?
Yes, please, Professor.
No, just the final part of your argument. I think you gave a brilliant lecture, comprehensive, made an extremely persuasive case why economics and CITD should be more sensitive to the rest of the centers in the school, but to politics more generally. But you said that Trump's tariff or protectionist measures will lead, if I heard you right, to a collapse of the American economy. Intuitively, it doesn't make sense to me. If you raise tariffs as an entry barrier to the largest market in the world, which is the American market, and incentivize manufacturing within, and that's happening. I mean, Taiwan has opened the biggest semiconductor plant in Arizona with about 25,000 employees to begin with. You create domestic manufacturing, you create the basis of greater domestic consumption, and America can function without
the rest of the world.
Pretty much as long as it has the military might and the economic weight to be able to carry out these policies. So
I understand.
Yeah, so.
Shall I respond? This is
Maybe
a very interesting question.
Maybe we'll collect 2 more questions.
Okay.
Yeah, I think Professor Sahani and then after that Professor Pandit.
I'll sort of, mirror what the Dean said. Really fascinating lecture. It was wonderful. I was initially thinking I'll talk to you about Fukuyama, but I'm not going to do that because your last comments were just so sort of interesting and, and really in some ways provocative intellectually. Pratap Bhanu Mehta has suggested that actually Trump isn't so much transactional as he is a supremacist. And I just want to sort of, invite you to sort of consider kind of a take on that. It's not exactly what he says. I mean, I think we are correct when we characterize. That's become a bit of a commonplace now that Trump is transactional. But that's in terms of method. You know, I mean, I think we need to be aware of what the aims are. The aims are reasserting U.S. supremacy. It's not even hegemony, you know, in the sense in which we use it. I mean, this is actually supremacy, you know, and I think one of the key questions, therefore, to my mind, is going to be whether the U.S., in terms of its economic base, the fact that it has a significant presence in primary, secondary, as well as tertiary sectors of the economy, like few other countries do. You know, whether the US can actually, for a period of a few years, sustain that. You know, in other words, it's in a way, in some ways, the analogy is almost going back to the 1930s, when the whole world economy and isolationism, politically for the United States, but going hand in hand with the extreme autarky that we saw, you know, during the period after the Great Depression. So, is that in some ways the historical analogy that we need to consider? And I
kind of linked, yeah.
Yeah, Professor Pandit, and then we'll...
All right. Just a small query and maybe a comment. When you talked about the Ukraine war and India's position as something of a departure for India, well, in many ways, the position we took was something unique in the sense that it was also based on our national interest, our energy security, economic concerns, but in the past also India has been taking positions. Of course, those were the Cold War years. Our relations with West and US was not good. Whether it was Vietnam War, which we were mainly critical of the US war, or whether it was the Korean War in which we played a peacemaker. So even far away places, we had a role to play and we took positions which on many occasions were contrary to or opposed to US and the West.
Okay. Yeah. Let me begin with the third comment. You are absolutely right. We have taken positions, but we have never acted. We have never intervened actively. That's the difference I'm highlighting. Here there's a war going on somewhere else, and one of the countries, one of the warring parties, you know, we feel is being wrongly targeted. We're trying to help them, salvage them out. I mean, we can take positions. We say that we criticize Vietnam, okay, the Vietnam War. But what precious little did we do about it? We didn't have the wherewithal to do anything about it, let's put it this way. So that's the point I was taking to make, not to contest that we have not taken positions, all right? And of course, that's a foreign policy slippery slope, I would say, because we don't want to antagonize the Western allies too. So it's like walking on thin ice when you are saying US was, we all know how it was emphatic with the rest of the world to follow its sanctions against Russia. And when we said we would not do it, I think that's where the action comes in. Okay, so that's the point I'm trying to make. Yes, Amitabh's question is absolutely pertinent. In fact, you see, if we look at first, let us try to understand why did we have the general agreements on trade and tariff. Because theory tells us that if all countries start getting protectionist, then trade would disappear. And theory also tells us that free trade or trade is better than no trade. Okay? So a country would grow faster if it's following an open door policy. Now let's think of why we needed the WTO under the pressure from the US lobby in particular, because markets were getting satiated. The large tracts of the world were closed. So they wanted market access of their products. If their domestic demand is so high, why would they need the world economy? It's not just about production, it's about selling the product also. And for that you need a market. Now, if Trump imposes tariff, China retaliated, but I can assure you, it's maybe 30 to 40% of what China can do. And if China starts retaliating full, the US dollar could go for a sixer. The kind of reserves that the Chinese, hold in US dollars, okay? So therefore, it's not as though we sort of protect, we give our, industry protection. Yes, you mentioned Taiwanese investment. So yes, you can rely on restricting imports, but allowing foreign investments to come and produce in this country. But do you realize that if you don't have a working relationship with the country in question, what they did to Russia? They banned all investments in future. So what would happen to the country the moment there is a collapse of the diplomatic relations between the two, from where investments are flowing in, for instance, all right? So therefore, I can go on and on. Professor Apannasani teaches trade theory and gains from trade. I think maybe we can have a brief 2-minute summary on why countries gain from trade. And by the way, the kind of rate of growth that Chinese economy, I have already said that China is catching up. Even in nominal terms, it's almost there. 75%, 70% of the US economy. You see, how did China come to this level? It was at such a low base, but it's just the tyranny of numbers. They were growing fast. If they continue to grow fast, when they're at par, can you imagine where they would reach? Okay? And so therefore, it's a very complex, and that's where theory comes in. That's where trade theory comes in. That's where CITD comes in. So I'll request Aparna to just...
Thank you, Amit. I think perhaps later you can also comment on the fact that the nature of trade has also changed in terms of the production systems. We're not just looking at end of the life, not just the finished products, but also intermediate and inputs. But in terms of the gains of trade, and I think this is what the first years have just started, yes, free trade is the best policy. And if you think of the world economy as a whole, it would be maximizing a benefit. But when you think in a unilateral term, if you're a large country with economic prowess and with market power, so there is a difference that yes, market prices convey the value and so on and so forth, but only when there is perfect competition. So in the case when you think of the world economy, where the US had the economic prowess of being the largest trader within the world economy, having double-digit share of the world trade, now has been just overshot by China. If you impose a tariff at the border, then you actually turn the terms of trade in your favor, and you actually get a higher welfare because the terms of trade are now biased towards you, so you're better off than in free trade. So Trump's recent call, where he also knows he has to do something, one, to of course appease his voter base, second, to also prove that we have the economic prowess, is not, one, of course, they have scuttled the WTO. They don't believe in multilateralism because they feel threatened by China and the growing South. So now is to say that I'll not go to the negotiation table. I will just announce unilaterally a threat. And it's a credible threat because I announce it, or before even announcing it, India falls in line and says, we're going to actually lower the tariffs. So you've got what you wanted without being at the negotiating table, without actually having to negotiate at all. And that is to do with your large country. So he's basically proved that I'm still a large country. So I'll stop here, I think.
Yeah, and well, that will not work vis-a-vis China.
Yeah, but can I just add one comment? That if politics would teach you something, it's that big powers always prefer bilateral deals. That is the default response. Multilateralism only in exceptional situations of suboptimality, where unilateral action will not give you the dividends. That's a general principle. In South Asia, India would like to deal with all its neighbors, ideally bilaterally.
Right, right. You are absolutely right on that. Now, coming to Varun's question, well, yes, I mean, if you say Trump is supremacist, I would not disagree at all. You know, I'm yet to see. Because I don't understand international politics. I don't understand international politics theory, for instance, okay? Or international relations theory. So you would be the one to, you know, I just observe and sort of, you know, form my own judgment about it. He's a businessman, he talks and acts like a businessman. That's what I've noticed, all right? So, but yes, maybe the deeper underpinning of that would be a supremacist kind of, you know, shall we say megalomania or whatever, you know, I don't know.
And with the head of the Dorsch who is clearly
Exactly.
pushing that same agenda.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
So if there are some quick questions from students, I would like to get that. There is one from the gentleman. Please, sir. Yeah. The one wearing a cap. Also Archana ma'am. After that. No, first student. Yeah. First student.
Sir, I am Vishrit Das, PhD second year, Center for West Asian Studies. My question is about the 2008 financial crisis. On its study 2008 financial crisis, we find that there is a change in legal architecture in the US financial system from Gross-Steagall Act to Graham-Lynch Act. Why it is happened? Second question, when we discuss about the growth story, we forget a single country, that is Japan. In 1994, Japan is the second largest economy with $5 trillion and US is the first largest economy, $8 trillion. What happened in Japan after 1994? Why Japan never hit its full potential as a economic player that like China happened? China.
Thank you. The second student and then Archana ma'am. Please identify yourself.
My name is George and I'm from Diplomacy and Disarmament, PhD. And my question is, like I want to further what Professor Sani referred to, that is Banu Pratap Mehta's argument. He particularly stresses that Trump is not transactionalist. He uses leverage to make deal making, and that's more like a bully. And that of course does not work with China like you mentioned, because there are like structural problems, such as for example the rocks versus chips example, where China has all the leverage over the rocks, and of course US has over chips.
Yeah.
Thank you. Over to Professor Archana Mehta.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Ray. It's always fascinating to hear about this interface of economics and politics. And just going back to some of the discussions we had yesterday about the distances between theory and public policy, I was wondering, in 1930 when the Tariff Act was being passed, when the Smoot-Hawley tariffs were being enacted by President Herbert Hoover, there were 1,000 economists who had a signature campaign beseeching him and requested him not to enact these tariffs and the impact they would have on the American economy. And yet that went ahead because of the politics of the time, etc. So I was just curious to know whether you see some sort of a pushback from the trade theorists in the United States or outside to the recent public policy changes that we see, the announcements, etc. Or do you foresee something like that happening? It's almost like a return of the 1930s.
Excellent questions. In fact, the first one, the financial crisis, you see any crisis and which was obviously not predicted or predictable would evoke some institutional responses. And I think the legal intervention that you talked about is a fallout of that. So there is nothing surprising about it. If we did not know how to tackle, maybe this is what went wrong, so we make a law about it. Japan. Don't get me started on Japan, because you see, Japan grew at unprecedented. If you look at the evolution of the world economy, the fastest growing economy in the first half of the last century. 1900 to 1950 was the USA. Then from 50s and 60s it was Japan which take off, the East Asian miracle, the flying geese model. And then of course there is a whole process. I gave a talk on that a few days back.
No, go ahead.
And so, I have written on it, why Japan, how Japan kind of, you grow and then your growth rate tapers off. You understand, if you start growing at 10%, I mean, it's like a baby, the growth rate of the baby is very high. But then even as an adult, if he grows at that, he will become a giant. So, that's what happens. US growth rates tapered off, Japan's growth rates tapered off, and other babies are coming up. And they're being taller than the others. It's as simple as that. There's nothing surprising about it. Yes, thank you very much for calling Trump a bully. I would possibly, echo the same sentiments, although I didn't use that in the speech. Archuna's question is fascinating. Please, thank you for reminding me of this. And yes, indeed, this kind of vindicates the position that I was taking. And I'm really surprised that economists are not coming forward to advise Trump to say that this would not work in the long run. But I'm not very hopeful that it would, given the bully that Trump is, So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much. With this, we bring this session to a close. I thank once again my colleague, Professor Amit Shovon. I thank the organizers of the Kunzru Memorial Lectures for organizing such wonderful sessions, one after another. And thank you so much for this. I thank all participants, colleagues, students, and everyone here from within JNU and from outside JNU for being on this platform. Thank you very much.